Kate Kruesi, please take it away. Practicalities of Habitat Gardening.
Why, thank you. This is my current garden here in Burlington, which is a pretty garden. But what am I talking about when I say practicalities of habitat gardening? So what is habitat gardening? If we look here amongst all these pretty flowers, this brown arrow is showing us all the leaves that fall, because you'll see later, this is a forested neighborhood and this is a sunny opening in a forested neighborhood. But I leave the leaves and break up the stems here. So that's where all the bird activity is on the ground, looking for seeds and the insects that are there. It's year-round shelter for insects. And then back here is, speaking of habitat, is agastache is called hyssop, wild hyssop. The stems, which we'll talk about later, belong to this plant, and they're great for stem nesting bees. Another thing that you can see in this garden is, this is a young serviceberry. It's probably 2 years old here. This is the earliest bloom or floral resources for pollinators in this garden. Right now, I'm pretty sure this is late June. This is the Ohio spiderwort, and this is a very important pollen source, early season pollen source after these early spring blooming shrubs and trees have been a floral resource. Pollen is important for insects for feeding their young. Just like we've learned caterpillars are crucial for birds to feed their young because there's protein and fats. Pollen is the same thing for bees for feeding their larvae. They need the fats. They may mix nectar with it, but they don't feed pure nectar to their young in general. And then later in the season, this is the pollen source behind the word practicalities. This is a shrubby St. John's wort bush, and it's a significant pollen source midsummer. And then we've got some flowers here, and they're different shapes. You can see these have the longer tubes because bees, especially the bumblebees, have different length tongues, short, medium, and long. So you need to provide floral resources for all those tongue lengths for them to be successful. Here's a penstemon, another bell-shaped flower that bumblebees can fit into. They're designed for bumblebees. We'll see more on that later. Here's some Bradbury's monarda, and different floral shape. This is a cone flower. We'll see all these at a later stage. So that's the next season of bloom. And you all know what a cone flower looks like. So that you can imagine that the short-tongued bees would find that a better nectar resource for them. Then there is the this baptisia here. It's the creamy baptisia. It's a prairie one. It's a legume flowers. You all know what pea flowers look like. There's certain bees that specialize in legume flowers. We will see that later. It's also a nitrogen fixer, and you want to become aware of nitrogen fixing plants when you're putting together a community of plants. And then finally, here we are back to this penstemon with a big purple arrow. Excuse me. Notice the purple leaves. This is a cultivar of the penstemon, and research has shown that caterpillars, the host caterpillars that would be using penstemons won't eat purple leaves. So it's something I'm going to change, but big picture, I have a whole bunch of resources in this garden, so I don't need to change it right away, but perfection would mean, yes, I'd want to change it out. So habitat, we need to create more of it. We need to repair our history of erasing it across the landscape with agriculture and development. And we need to reconnect our natural landscape fragments, because bumblebees, I think, can plant up to a mile. I'm not positive about that. But most of our native bees are, they only half that distance at most. So you can see they need their habitat pretty close. So it would take a while for insects to make, or animals for that matter, to make their way across this landscape. So we need to reconnect it, and that's what we can do in our homes. So how to get started? Let's replace some of this lawn in this. This is our home pre-2015 when we moved in, and we need to create more ecological function or habitat in this yard. So first, what are the site conditions? The front is sunny and mostly sand near the driveway, though loamier in the front, and summers can be droughty. The foundation shrubs in front of the house are non-native, planted way too close to the foundations, and so they needed to be removed. But it looks like there's an older intact woodland with similar soils in back. So let's take a look. Here we are in April 2015. We can see there's a nice, large, diverse tree species mix out back here. And because of their height and canopy spread, a lot of moth and butterfly species are hosted here without us doing anything at all. It's there. However, note the bare compacted soil with thin grass struggling in the shade. So here we are, a year later, we moved in midsummer and got to work. So here's my first tip. It's easy to transition shaded, thin grass to a diverse woodland habitat by adding 1 to 2 inches of compost, ramial wood chips, and fallen leaves, and then planting. Ramial wood chips are hardwood branches and treetops cut up. They have a lot of bark in it, which is where all the nutrients in a tree are in its bark. So of course, twigs have lots of bark with a little bit of wood. Trunks are not as useful. They're just pure carbon. And I wanted hardwood chips, not pine chips. If I were in a pine forest, I would want that, but I'm not. So the point of adding the compost and the wood chips and leaving the fallen leaves is I'm trying to jumpstart the high organic matter forest soil conditions that would be in a regular forest. And this is the first and last mulch this area will receive. So here we are the next summer. You can see I've planted sparsely. I'm going through my checklist. I've got the large native canopy trees that host the greatest diversity of any plant you could add. Did I need to plant some mid-layer smaller trees and shrubs? Yes, I did. And this is to add a diversity and my more beauty. So I added some witch hazels. I've added a rhododendron. There's aronias. There's several witch hazels. You can only see one here, obviously. I also have a red bud just almost over my left shoulder in this photo. Another tip, after planting where lawn is needed, it's a good idea to add edging to provide a neat definition to nature's messy look. And so finally, you want to choose your ground layer, diverse clumping plants amidst spreading plants and fallen leaves. And so the clumpers in this picture are the American spikenard here. I have some Christmas ferns across the way. And then the cedars, you can see some geranium leaves here. I think there's maybe more here. And I had them widely scattered and they seed themselves. They shoot out their seeds, I think up to 10 feet. So they could do a pretty good job of seeding themselves around. You just need to start with a few. And then I have woodland asters and goldenrods. And the spreaders are tiarella. I started with just little pots of clumps. And wild ginger, not in this photo, it's over to the right. I planted some wintergreen. You can see it right here. And then there's thimbleberry here in the back, some oak fern that is a nice ground cover, and Pennsylvania sedge, which we'll talk about later. It's not an, so here we are 5 years later. I should have said 4. And you can see here that the plants have spread. I just had a few little pots of tiarella and I divided it and spread it more widely. There's more here and I've given little chunks away. And the fallen leaves have not set back the woodland plant growth. And more about that in a bit. So what are the pollinator food resources in woodlands? Earliest are the trees overhead. It's red maples. This is a red maple here in the middle. And then spring ephemerals. I don't have many spring ephemerals because they're very hard to get started. They're very hard to obtain ethically. They really need mature forest conditions. And next to the house, this is a disturbed site. And so this woodland back here also provides nesting resources. So what would they be? The Northeast was really, we were all forested. We had very few open communities and they were usually tied to lakes, waters, or wetlands. So our native bees really had to be forest bees, shall we say. And so many native bees nest in rotting wood, rodent holes, hollow stems, and leaf litter. And I want to even note these stems. These are figwort stems. It's a gigantic, it's like a nearly 8-foot tall plant. It grows in clusters along the fence here. And I thought, oh, I'll just try poking them in the ground and see if they get used. In the meantime, they might look like sculpture of some kind. Sure enough, they did get used. This is one of them, probably from over here. And you can see the pith has been mined out by a bee. And so brush piles, here's my brush pile behind that big red oak that was in the very first woodland photo I showed you. Stumps, you can see some holes here in the stump. You can see some holes and cracks here. And fallen logs provide cover and nest sites. And here this is in Colorado. I found a stump sawed down just like this stump that I found at my place, and complete with a bee climbing out of it. Then I also now, when I go take walks in the woods, I look for these rotting logs and signs of holes. It's like, well, where would these forest bees be nesting? So you can do the same when you take your next forest walk. So here we are, July. So this is midsummer and it's a quieter time, but there's still some bloom. And it's really all about the light. Blooms in forests are early and late season or at edges and openings. So the flowers that are blooming midsummer are edge and forest edge or forest opening species. And you can see some skullcap here. And then late September, it's very important to provide fall goldenrods and asters for the migrating butterflies and our overwintering bumblebee gines. And bumblebee gines are what next year's queens are called when they hatch out in the late summer. And their job, what they have to do in late summer is basically fatten up, kind of like a bear. And they need the nectar, and I think probably pollen too, but I think it's mostly nectar from the asters and goldenrods to be fat enough, have enough stores to survive the winter and come out and emerge as a bumblebee queen once they mate with a drone. Or actually, sorry, they mated the fall before. Another tip is to break up fallen branches to recycle their nutrients. Twigs and bark are where the tree stores its minerals, and the rest is just carbon in the trunk. And these minerals, the normal recycling process in a forest is the bark breaking down, the fungi breaking it down, microbes helping break it down, and that all supports the tree health and the plant health. And then the leaves are only raked off the path. The rest are left. And I do remove them from the path because you don't want to use your gardens as leaf dumps, because that truly the plants won't grow through that. If you notice those pillows and hollows in a woodland, those little dips that fill up with leaves. You'll notice plants aren't growing in those because it really is too much. It's too thick a blanket. And so when you walk in the woods in spring, observe how woodland plants strategize pushing up through the leaf litter, because all these plants here are adapted to the woods. So somehow they make it through leaves, but not a thick mat of leaves. And here is Jack in the Pulpit. Ironically, this is a little wind bared patch of soil, but you can clearly see they have a very effective way of spearing their way up through. The trilliums do the same thing. They their leaves are folded up into a point that pushes up. And also insect eggs, pupae, and adults come down with those leaves, or they seek shelter in the litter. So you really want to avoid shredding or removing all the insect diversity that you're trying to increase with your plantings. So obviously, if we had a mulching lawnmower, I might shred the leaves that are in the path. I mean, we can't leave everything for the insects. We live here too. But you don't want to remove all the leaves from everywhere, because you are literally taking away that reproductive stages of the insects that were living up in your trees. And Claudia Thompson, founding director of Grow Native Massachusetts, said this wonderful phrase. It's like, leaf litter is the habitat loss on our landscapes. Hope that's a take-home message. So shared back of the house is done. And you can see we had a pretty much half of our lot is woodlot. But what to do with the sunny front? And this is Habitat Network no longer exists, but it was an initiative by the Nature Conservancy and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which was a great way to sort of analyze your property. Do I need to add a tree up front? Our neighborhood was developed in the 60s in a mature forest, but you can see there's holes in the canopy. There used to be in our yard, I guess, there were two very large hemlocks. I think there was another large oak or something in our neighbor's yard. So this would have been, it would have been like our house next door. You could hardly see the roof. And we have come to find out that yes, we would like a shade tree, because this is the hottest angle of the sun in the summertime over hot pavement, and it'd be nice to shade all that. So we planted, or the city planted for us, swamp white oak in our median here, which will be long lived and cool our home over time, maybe future residents of the house. And oaks support the largest diversity of moth and butterfly caterpillars because of their height. We'll talk about that later. This neighborhood, the long-term succession of this neighborhood should be back to forest, not keep opening it up. So maybe I should plant some future forest understory trees for a mid-layer in this sunny front yard. And indeed I have. I planted a witch hazel here, and that serviceberry that we were that you saw at the beginning is there. And now we should define what lawn we actually need for paths and play areas and service access to the rear. And now got all that. So what natural communities can we imitate for sunny sites? Because as I've just said, this isn't a lakeside, a riverside, or a wetland site. This is pretty dry sand here. And not as dry as I originally thought, but though our Vermont's natural communities are not sources for this site. So I happen to have a son who lives in Chicago, our youngest does, and I joined the Illinois Native Plant Society. I'm that geeky to go on their field trips when it worked out. And I've been on one, and we went to two sites. This is one of them. This is Long Grove Forest Preserve Prairie in Illinois. And it has, you'll already notice, you've seen this phlox, the inflorescence looks a little different, in my title page. So I was already onto it, although I planted it before I saw this site. So there's medium to moist soils here. There's scattered canopy trees, kind of like what front yard was looking like. Bur oak, there's black walnuts here. There's shrub masses, a lot of dogwoody family members. There's probably some willows, but I'm not sure if that's willows or not. And there's a huge diversity of ground cover plants. I was like a kid in a candy store, because in my Tinmouth gardens, where I gardened for 30 years, and I planted a lot of prairie natives, it was like seeing them in their real sites. It was very exciting to see them. And there are also tall grass prairie species. You can see this is probably big blue stem. And we'll talk about that later, but I just want to keep reiterating, tall grass prairie species were ecologically managed, self-managed by Native American fire, which was on an average frequency of every 1.5 years, research has shown, or massive herds of buffalo came through and cleaned it out. So, and that's something that we don't have happening in our gardens, and that's hard to mimic. So just heads up. And I noticed in this photo, there's actually a dead stem from the previous year for stem nesting bees. So this looks like a sunny grassland community model if you have medium to moist soils. And I've already mentioned that it's rare in the Northeast, so we do have to look south or along the Great Lakes. At the edge of recent glaciation, there's a lot of great plants in natural grassland communities that we can use as source ideas for recreating novel grassland communities in our Vermont originally forested landscapes. And now it's climate change that's moving those plants. Before it was glaciers that moved our plants, hundreds of miles south, and then they've been working their way back up north and continue to. And the climate change is only accelerating that, except plants don't move that fast. And so it's smart to use a ecoregion approach in looking at your plants. And this is from the Native Plant Trust Plant Finder site. They simplified, I think it's the EPA mapping system, ecoregion mapping system. And so you can see, if you're probably, many of you are in this Northeastern Highlands zone. Those of us in the Champlain Valley are here in the Eastern Great Lakes and Hudson Lowlands zone. And so you can see it's sort of, we're all sort of flat plains along the St. Lawrence and around all the Great Lakes. And interestingly, when I do rare plant surveys, a lot of the cool rare plants in the Champlain Valley are on the eastern edge of their range because of this ecoregion phenomenon. So here is the other site we went to on that field trip day in Illinois. It's a drier Illinois gravel hill prairie site. Their plant communities all talk about gravel or hill, or they're just different shades of, they don't have that many different forest communities. And note the Ohio spiderwort, just like in the first title slide. Here's the pale coneflower, which actually comes closer to us ecoregionally than the purple coneflower. So I'm trying to plant, I'm planting more of these in bare root in my garden, just to see how they do, because I think they are supposed to last longer than purple coneflower as well. And you can see the prairie, a mixture of prairie grasses. Here's a sedge here, and you can see there's composites, asters and goldenrods, et cetera, that are going to come on later in the season. And this is what was at the top of that center of the meadow that I was just now showing you. It's a little oval raised terrace that has never been plowed. So it is a true prairie fragment that's thousands of years old. And we had to climb up a bank about 10 feet tall. So even if you had horse-drawn plowing equipment, it just wasn't worth your while to get equipment up there to plant. It looks a little weird because they had just treated it with herbicide to control the honeysuckle, but it was an amazing sight to see. But you can see it's a fragment. Look at the gravel pits right over the fence line. The prairie fragments out in the prairie states are frighteningly small. So here we are, got some ideas now. Back to the sunny front of the house. We had somebody come in, we had to pull out those shrubs. There was a brick walkway here that acted like a dam, causing flooding in the basement prior. Got rid of that. And we wanted to slow down the water and also just be able to use it to for the plants there. And so here we are, just a month later, it's all planted. I like out back, I added compost and wood chips, but here I didn't add as much because native plants in general in the sunny sites prefer leaner soils, unless we're talking a wetland. This is not a wetland. So I didn't want to over fertilize. It makes the plants flop, or it makes any Eurasian competitors who we've selected to thrive on very fertile conditions. They will have a head start. Of course, I removed everything. So anyway, it's just a good tip. Don't over fertilize or even fertilize your native plants. And I used the wood chips also because of the ramia wood chips, because to sort of as a fungal inoculant to just get more soil activity happening, soil microbial activity. And again, this is the last mulch these beds will ever receive. And this is fully planted, believe it or not. It doesn't look like much because I use plugs to plant with. They're they're small, they're inexpensive, and they're not overgrown. You can see they're grown just enough to fill their pots with roots, and they're just ready to root out into the ground and just grow a massive root system and then shoots. Usually they just stay small the first year because they're growing all those roots. And then in the future years, they grow tall. And so it's a great way to fill a large area fast. And also I just want to point out, I do a lot of research before I plant. I always care. I make tables. I have a plant list for my gardens. I care especially how wide the plant is going to be at maturity, because I don't want to plant the plants too close together. People used to really admire my gardens in Tinmouth, but that's because I was a patient gardener. I waited, I knew how big the plant was going to get, and I gave it the space it needed. And then it looks really strikingly magnificent, but all I did was just plant it not too close to the neighbors. So it really, you want to pay attention to how close you plant your plants based on what the plants, the space that they need. And I also knew that these plants were going to self-seed because I'm trying to set up a little self-sustaining prairie out here. I make the first decisions and they make the follow-up planting decisions with a little guidance from me. So here we are in June the following year. The plants are growing. You can see how much bigger those. So this was just a little plug, a small plug of butterfly weed. And I think I mentioned it. Yes, I started with 6 plants of orange butterfly weed, but they have seeded themselves all over the gardens, and I'm able to give seedlings away. You can see the purple coneflower. That would have been one of the plants we saw on the first slide. And this is the shrubby St. John's wort that I was talking about. That is such a pollen source. It's just starting to bloom here. You can see a few yellow blooms. And this is, it's now 3 times this size, and it's at its mature size. And so you can see what these are. Since it's July, these are the early midsummer nectar and pollen resources. Now we are moving to September, and you can see it's all filled in. And so here's another tip, and this is the same view. It's as my title slide, only I cropped it more for the title slide. I can hardly walk in there to do any weeding, and it doesn't need any weeding because those plants have knit together. They're shading the ground. There's a few openings here and there that they can self-seed themselves into. The only thing I have to worry about to keep an eye on is tree seedlings that might find their way in, because I have a forest of seed producing trees around me. And the squirrels plant acorns, but you just walk through, pull those out, maybe once or twice a year, and you're done. And so here's another tip that I didn't really figure out until I created this PowerPoint. Clumping plants are easier to manage in sunny sites. Spreaders literally can take over because there's so many more resources in a sunny site than there is a woodland. Specifically, there is sun, light, and so spreading plants can grow quite aggressively, which you can use to your advantage if you have a meadow. Well, this isn't a meadow. This is just a small front yard. And then you can see the late summer pollen and nectar sources. You have some smooth aster here. The hyssop-leaved boneset is just starting to bloom. It's amongst the latest. So, that's one of my latest pollen and nectar resources. And it's a sand-loving boneset. I now have 3 bonesets in my garden. I have this sand lover because I can't grow the wetland white boneset, I think we call it. I have one place on the side of my house that's moist and shady enough where it can grow. And then I discovered in doing rare plant surveys that there is a boneset that grows on our limestone outcrops. So I found a nursery in New Jersey that stocks that. So I cover all 3 Vermont habitats of bonesets here. And you can see the coneflowers are still blooming here. So, okay, we talked a lot about plants, but then what comes? You hear plant it and they will come. Here's a penstemon. You can see this. So this is a little bit about flower shape, and then the cool critters that arrive. The penstemons are really designed for bumblebees to pollinate them. They're shaped for a bumblebee. The bumblebee has the strength to pull its way into this flower, the corolla there, and it has this is a species with a long enough tongue to stick down in and get the nectar here. And then these white lines here are actually the stamens, which have the pollen on them to brush off on the top of the bumblebee. So amazing evolution here. This is a bee. I couldn't get an identification on it from iNaturalist, but you notice this plant isn't in bloom. This is the Arkansas blue star. But there's some bees will collect, oils and sort of gums. I can't think of the right word for it, but there's sort of sticky resinous substances protecting buds, or and there's even the yellow loosestrife, the common yellow loosestrife. There's a specialized bee that collects oil. That flower has oil secretion instead. I think it's instead of nectar. So it's sort of where you would find nectar. And that's a specialist bee that goes for that oil to bring and to feed its young. And it's a kind of a rare bee. So we need to plant more yellow loosestrife, common yellow loosestrife. And I have some on order for my garden this summer. So anyway, they collect these oils either to feed their young, because that's what they evolved to do, or to make the walls between the larval cells in the stems. And then the pea flowers have specialist bees that like them. This is a megachile bee, I think is how you pronounce it. And sorry, I'm trying to move something here. And notice that the bee, actually this may be pollen on the rear leg of this bumblebee. This bee with the blue star has hairs on its leg, just like the bumblebee. That's where it's going to pack in pollen to take back to its nest. This megachile bee collects pollen on the bottom of its abdomen. And they like the redbud flowers, you know, all the pea flowers and the baptisias, etc. So that's pretty cool. Here's another bumblebee. This is on the limber honeysuckle, which is a native Vermont honeysuckle vine. And it's kind of interesting to look at these flowers because you can see the stamens here, the pollen stamens, but clearly this is, if the flower wants a hummingbird to come and pollinate it, because it's the stigmas which they want to get the pollen onto to get fertilized. A bumblebee isn't going to do that for you. Bumblebee is just going to dig in and try to get the nectar down here and move on. So for me to get berries on this, I need a hummingbird to come by. This is New Jersey tea. So here we had, we're looking at flower shapes, long tubed, we don't know yet. This is just for oils. We got the pea flower. Here's a sort of a flat flowers, a flat group of flowers, an inflorescence of flowers. And so this is great for the short-tongued bees. This is a Mexican grass-carrying wasp, I think is what it was. And the New Jersey tea are plants that are pollinator magnets. So that's why I always wanted to plant them, only I discovered they're rabbit magnets as well. So hence that wooden fence that you saw, or the fencing you'll see in photos, is to keep rabbits out, because the stems of New Jersey tea never get big enough to, rabbits do pencil-sized stems. New Jersey tea never gets bigger than pencil size, so it just wouldn't survive. And this is the spotted horse mint, another of the bee balms that loves dry sand, but it needs disturbed dry sand and not much competition. And let's see, I think that's a soldier beetle. It's a cool looking critter. And then I found a massacre scene one time in my garden. This is an ambush bug. And this was like a dead, like a flower fly or a bee, I can't remember which, just like immobilized here. And I think it's headless as well. So you never know what you're going to find. And then lastly, these megachile bees, the one that was on the baptisia, they are a group called the leaf cutting bees. So if you see plants with little circles cut out, this bee has come to cut those to either make little larval chambers for its young, or to make spacers between the larval chambers for its young. All very fascinating. Okay, now this same garden, we look at it basically in the winter, dormant season, and its seeds and stems. So migrating and resident birds are regularly found scratching around on the ground, and goldfinches, etc., will be the only activity I've seen on seed heads of significance is on the what do you call it, cone flowers. I haven't seen them on the others. And then so in March, now we're going to talk about stem stubble and what do bees need for nesting, those stem nesting bees. So the stems, so what do they want? They want a stem the center of which is at least 1/8 of an inch in diameter, because the bee has to be able to fit in there. The stems need to be hollow or pithy. If they're solid, the bee can't use it. So if those two boxes are checked when you're cutting back your stems in your garden, you want to cut these stems back to 8 to 24 inches, because there's different bees like different heights. And then the rest of the stems that don't qualify, you can just break down. So you can see I only have a couple of patches of stems, much of which you can't see because of the rabbit fence. But the rest of it is broken back and dropped in place. And then lastly, you want to cut your stems just below a leaf node where you can see leaves coming out to ensure it's the longest straw for nesting in, because the leaf nodes are solid and the bees can't drill through. So here is a wonderful diagram that Heather Holm has put together. And she's amazing. She's written 3 books, one on plants for pollinators, one on our native bees, and one on our native wasps. All 3 are excellent. She's gives a lot of talks. If you see her name, sign up and listen. She was at North Branch Nature Center in early March. And so she gave me, and she shares, if you ask permission, she shares her educational materials. So she and friends created this diagram. So how do you create habitat for stem nesting bees? So I was showing you that big garden full of stems. I told you which stems to choose. And so that first spring, and that you're going to cut them back following those standards that I just explained, so that then bees that have hatched out from somewhere nearby, clearly not your stems because you didn't leave them the year before, but somewhere nearby, they have hatched out and they're ready to, they're looking for places to start their laying eggs. And so there's a nice little diagram here that get a pollen ball, put a egg on top, and then a little barrier in between, and then repeat the process and fill the stem up. Also, I wanted to explain that most of our insects are larvae most of their lives, and adults for a couple of weeks or maybe a month of their lives, because the adult stage, the only job is to mate and lay eggs and reproduce, and then they fulfill their purpose and die. The rest of their life is as an egg or a larvae that's eating a lot of food. And that's hard for us to remember because we see the adults and we assume they live all year long, but insect life cycles, most insect life cycles are not like that. Okay, so we cut the stems. Some of them got used. In the summer, the plants quickly grow up. You can see this is a great example. And those eggs have hatched. They're little larvae. In the fall, they become bigger larvae. You can leave them over winter. I was talking with somebody manages a lot of properties for New York State Parks, Finger Lakes Parks District or something like that. And he was saying he cut back his stems in November, knowing it's cutting them back for stem nesting bees. And I realized, it really doesn't matter as long as it's dormant when you cut your stems back, as long as you leave some for the bees. So you may have a garden you just want to clean up in November, and that's okay. Your birds may be missing out on seed heads, and you may be missing out on the beauty of those seed heads in the snow, but that's your choice. It doesn't matter. So, okay, they our cut stems have survived the fall, they've survived the winter, the larvae are growing and growing, and then next spring, in another month, they are going to start hatching out of these little big larvae, which may even be pupae. I'm not quite sure. I don't know my insect life cycles that well, are become adults and come out of these old gray stems. So they have used these stems for 11 months of the year. Those stems need to stay up. There's never a good time to cut them down because they might be in use. So then these bees here have hatched out of these stems. They're going to mate, and then they're going to use look at these new stems for repeating the cycle. And then here is a great photo of a close-up of a slice through of what the stems might look like from Heather. So a few more practical tips here. Know whether a species is a clumper or a spreader. Generally use clumpers and self-seeders if you want ease of maintenance, especially in sunny areas. Use spreaders judiciously, and this especially is important with milkweeds. This is our native milkweed. It spreads vigorously and is very hard to get out of a garden. And so instead, plant clumping milkweeds. We have the butterfly milkweed is good for dry to medium soils, and swamp milkweed is good for medium to wet soils. Native grasses have gotten a lot of press too. A practical tip is to aim to work with little blue stem and purple love grass. They're shorter, and this is little blue stem, which is just beautiful in a breeze. It waves magically. And then this purple haze here are the seed heads of purple love grass, which is in the fall. And there's a purple haze over here. Because these grasses produce a lot less straw to process. The tall grass prairie species like switchgrass need fire or buffalo to manage, as I mentioned before. This is my old garden in Tinmouth, just to show you how big and dense. This is, I don't know, probably 8-year-old or more plant of miscanthus. It's not a native. It's an Asian equivalent of our tall prairie grasses. And because it grows in similar site conditions, but look at all the straw that it produces. And that's pretty hard to find a place for in your landscape. And not to mention, it was physically very hard on my tendons to cut that down each spring. So just a word of wisdom. Plus here, you see far more of, well, in the Champlain Valley, I don't think you see many of our native grasses inland as much, other than the woodland grasses. But here in the Champlain Valley, you see far more little blue stem and purple love grass than the tall grass, the other tall grass prairie species. On the another grass tip, the Low-mow grass lawns, be careful what you wish for. These are aggressive Eurasian fescues and are cool season grasses. They do their job well. They're very durable for foot traffic, great for walking paths, edges of paths next to a wild meadow, because here in Burlington, a big project is going to happen, I think, this summer, and there's going to be a nice walking path through. They're seeding a lovely prairie meadow, but the designers wisely added sort of like an apron of the Low-mow grass next to the path, because the tall meadow plants can be literally overwhelming when you walk near them, especially after a rain. They're just like too many plants too close up. So it's good to use for a buffer. These Low-mow grasses, if you want to use them, they have a purpose, are best for sun or partial shade. You wouldn't want to do them in full shade. And they do create a very dense root sod, which is their success. It's just not a deep rooting sod like the prairie grasses. And it's incompatible with adding native plants after the fact, by adding seedings here or digging holes. This would be very difficult to dig holes in. And so if you change your mind, what can you do? Because I was asked, well, what could we do here, Kate? It's like, well, this is a pretty hard area to really change. But if you wanted to, you could, I have to give credit to listening to talks by Larry Weiner. You want to exploit the difference. This is a cool season grass. You want the warm season grasses. Those prairie grasses don't come up until later. These come up early. So if you wait and let these, like late May, early June, they've used a lot of their root reserves to grow this lush top. Top growth. I'm calling it scalp mowing because I think it gives you an idea. Cut it as close as possible and rake up all the debris. Then you'll have little bits of bare soil nooks where you could spread seed or try. I think I would just spread seed and to get some warm season, the desirable species, give them a head start. And then you would have to scalp mow at the same time the next 2 springs. So you're gradually exhausting these Eurasian grasses and selecting for the warm season prairie plants that aren't going to be coming up until just after you finish this mowing. Okay, so for partial shade, there's some wonderful no-mow, low-mow grasses, which are in fact sedges. Sedge lawns in bright shade conditions are deservedly popular. Pennsylvania sedge is getting a lot of press. And look at the site conditions. This is a natural community, and this is Green Dump Hill in Castleton in June 5th, so it's still early in the season. And the natural community name is a dry oak hickory hophorn beam forest. And so you can note the thin tree canopy, because the sedge needs some light. It just doesn't want to be in, it doesn't want to be in pure shade. It doesn't want to be in pure sun. Just wants enough light. Just it's a Goldilocks amount of light. And so everybody falls in love with this type of woodland because it looks like sort of estate forests in England. There are some clumpers in here. So the sedge obviously is a spreader, great example of a spreader. And so there's some nitrogen fixing legumes in here, which, as I've mentioned before, is a crucial nutrient for the site. So landscape applications, Pennsylvania sedge is a spreader. The cheapest way to start is to buy bare root stems and space them 8 to 12 inches apart. Or I noticed a nearby nursery was advertising that they had Pennsylvania sedge in for $16, but they were large pots, and you could buy that was in fact a real deal if you were pulled it apart and spread out the bare root shoots. You could plant quite a large area with that $16 pot. And then you could choose appropriate clumpers to lightly scatter amongst the sedges. That would be just absolutely beautiful. And here is my bare root sedge planting. And this is 3 years after I put in the bare roots. So this is probably one of the first bare roots. That was probably the second. And then these guys here have, it sends out runners, that's the spreading part, are filling it in. So my planting looks like this, the patches where I planted it look just like this green dump hill site. So habitat garden takeaways. Trees, native ones really matter. You want to check your neighborhood context. You know, what trees are already there, what species, what's missing, based on the site, of course, because you always want to think of diversity. We don't want to plant elms everywhere. We don't want to plant green ash everywhere. We know why that's wrong. Also, trees matter, as I mentioned at the beginning. Doug Tallamy talks about biomass. We hear him say 70% native plants. Well, what he's saying is you want 70% of the biomass on your site as native plants to be able to support nesting, chickadees, etc. So biomass, I think the simplest way to explain it is it's the weight of all the leaves on your property. Obviously, your mature trees are going to have the most leaves. And someone estimated that a mature canopy tree has the same amount of biomass, weight of leaves, leaf tissue, as about 3,500 square feet of prairie. So if you really want to make a difference to support native moth and butterfly species, you want to plant a tree or nurture the trees that you have, because that's your biggest bang for your buck on your property. It also supports the greatest number of caterpillars, covered that. And also it's the early spring bloom in our area, other than the spring ephemerals, which are not that widely spread. And it's a future shade and carbon sink for your site, all good reasons. Small trees, shrubs, that mid layer, again, this is the mid-spring, it's the next sort of floral resource after the early, the trees. It's the second highest biomass per square foot of trunk that you put in the ground. And it's also the source for berries for our resident and migrant birds. It's the main source of berries. And then the ground cover plants. These are, when you're talking phenology, this is the floral resources for the pollinators in summer and fall. So you can see you need all three layers somewhere in your neighborhood area to provide for pollinators. And this is also where you are going to most increase plant diversity is in the ground layer, because obviously you can grow a lot of little plants. One tree is one species. It's not hugely diverse. You can only get so diverse when you talk tree species on a acreage. So you can see the smaller plants increase that diversity. And in fact, I just ran across a tip that 80% of forests diversity is on the forest floor, which makes sense when you think about it. And also this is where you have the different flower shapes for all those diverse pollinating insects. Heather Holm again, she reminded me, Kate, this is Ohio phenology, so make sure your viewers see that. That means these boxes, these bars would be shifted to the right a couple of weeks. But you can see the wind pollinated trees, we're not going to pay attention to that because that's not for insects, that's wind. But you can see the insect pollinated trees come first, the insect pollinated shrubs extend that food source season, and then our ground cover plants kick in here, late May to June, cover the rest of the season through October. So somebody asked me when I gave this talk about a month back, well, Kate, great, you started with a bare site. What if you have an existing garden with low value Eurasian plants? What should you do? So go through this same checklist. Do you need a tree? And then start replacing a Eurasian shrub or two with natives that provide more ecological value, and see the learning resources at the end where you can find out how to make that selection. And then when you look at your flowering ground covers, create a list and evaluate what do they do. Do you have enough fall native asters and goldenrods for those migrating monarchs and bumblebee kinds? Those are probably your first thing to make sure you've got. Are there periods over the season where none of your plants are blooming? Well, there's an opportunity to provide a floral resource then. Are you providing pollen sources all summer long? Remember, insects need the protein and fats to be able to reproduce. And so you can add these, and you won't find this on our website yet, but it will be when we get it revised. Robert Jagiers and Jared Fowler's labs have lists that can help you be very specific about what plants provide what pollen or different type of floral resources at different seasons. And then also just look at the ones that you have. Do you cover a lot of options? Do you have long tube flower shapes, flat topped flower heads for different bees preferences? Add what you are missing. Additional habitat gardening takeaways, plant sourcing and selection. It's pretty important. Plants care about their site conditions. They'll tell you, and you want success. So choose your plants accordingly, learn your site and plant accordingly. And don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. You'll hear some people go on, well, that's not local genotype. They're acting on it based on an assumption. And what little research has been done, there was one research study done, I think, on milkweeds, and there was no difference in the genetic makeup of a milkweed from the Northeast compared to the same species growing out in the Midwest. And this is where it comes up, because it's easy to buy plugs of immense diversity of native plants from some Midwestern nurseries until our Northeastern nurseries catch up with growing plugs for us. And I have bought a lot of my plugs from the Midwest because I don't want perfection to be the enemy of diversity on my site. And also just remember that when I was talking about ecoregion in the glaciation, basically the plants got shoved down and they're all moving back. So plants are fluid and moving, and we got to just sort of work on science-based and actually keep our eyes on our long-term goal. Avoid most cultivars. Fireworks goldenrod is one exception to that. It's better than the native species. because several of the sun-living goldenrods are vigorous spreaders and you don't really want in your garden. So take it with a grain of salt. Just think, what is it providing the resources that's needed? Double flowers provide no floral resources for plants. Those extra petals used to be stamens producing pollen. They're useless now. Purple leaves, I mentioned earlier, studies have shown that they just don't taste good to caterpillars. They avoid using them. White variegated leaves there was no difference, so caterpillars would eat them. I would wonder, well, how nutritious is a leaf missing a lot of its chlorophyll, so it looks white, but nobody studied that. Pesticides, just be aware. You think, oh, duh, but do you have a problem with carpenter ants, so you're putting out a pesticide? Do you have larvae in your lawn? There may be other situations where you are not thinking you're actually killing insects. Just look into alternatives, because it could have impacts on these insects that you're trying to support more of. Maintenance, messy homes for all, every month of the year. Monitoring, have fun. Watch and guide change in your garden. Learn to ID seedlings. Those self-seeders will help you expand your garden. And you can have control over that. Sometimes you may want to weed them out. And then post the insects photos. You saw all those insects photos I took. That's just with an iPhone. Post them on iNaturalist to contribute to community science and basically learn, who did you see? And here's my final slide. I know I've gone a little bit over here. Learning resources. I'm going to leave this up during the Q&A session too. This is the website for our Grow Wild group. We hope to keep it up to date with the best learning resources, so it can be like one-stop shopping for learning more. And this is for geeks too. I'm a geek. I want that information. I want to find it easily. If you want to, there's this excellent book, The Pollinator Victory Garden. Don't buy many books these days unless they're major references. But this one is excellent. If you want one just to help you through the process, the key points, it's minimal words, lots of visuals, and she's tops in her at doing these types of talks that I'm giving right now. Plant finder databases, this is what I was talking about. I didn't provide web addresses. You will find them on our website. Native Plant Trust has a lot of useful filters for searching through plants. National Wildlife Federation tracks the number of basically caterpillars, moth and butterfly caterpillars on different plants, or the genera of them, which is very helpful if you want to add more moth diversity on your property. National Audubon Societies helps you understand what birds will use certain plants. Xerxes Society has a pollinator resource center by region. And obviously we would look at the Northeast. And then these online plant nursery websites, specifically Prairie Nursery, one of those Midwestern ones, I check regularly because it allows filtering by soil type. Some of you may be gardening in the Champlain Valley, so you want to know what will tolerate clay soils. We here in parts of Burlington want to know what tolerates sand soils. This is the only website that helps sort by soils. And then become a member of these educational websites. Wild Seed Project in Maine has lots of helpful information. I'm going to leave it up for you to read, but if you join, you get one of their small booklets. They have a great one on trees this year. There's a new one coming out on ground covers, and if you can get it for free for a membership, that's awesome. You can also buy regionally sourced seeds there. Grow Native Massachusetts, even before our COVID era, was recording monthly lectures for evenings with experts. So it's the way I could, up in northern Vermont, hear experts from all over the Northeast talk on these subjects. And Wild Ones is, I think, the oldest native plant gardening association out in Wisconsin. And they have really gotten a stronger national presence now, and they offer free lectures, which I've alerted Hardy Plant Club to this winter. They also, some of our members really like the regional garden design plans that they offer.
Well, Kate, thank you. Can you hear?